Okay. I've taken the title that was given for my talk, Small Modular Nuclear Reactors and Consent in Saskatchewan, What You Haven't Been Told. And the fundamentals that I want to stress are, first of all, the sacredness of the water and the importance of water, which is important to all forms of life on Earth. Without water, without clean water, without um, healthy water, we just don't have life. And the necessity for free, prior, and informed consent, as stated in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, but which should also be applicable to non-Indigenous people too, it seems to me. Thirdly, I want to stress the fact that these radioactive poisons, which are created in nuclear reactors, are a danger to health and safety in perpetuity. So we're talking about perhaps a few decades of benefit in terms of energy and whether it's electricity or heat or whatever, followed by an eternity of radioactive waste. Now, here's a picture of Chief Madabi of the Anishinaabe Nation in Ontario. In Ottawa in 2017, there was an alliance between the Anishinaabe Nation and the Iroquois Council, and they issued a declaration on the principles that should be applied to the radioactive waste produced by nuclear operations. I know that you can't read this, but the main points are 5 major points. First of all, no abandonment. We should not abandon these wastes. They're too dangerous. They're dangerous forever, and we have to keep an eye on it. We have to apply stewardship. We know how to package it. We know how to keep it out of the environment for decades at a time. We have to be intergenerational about this and realize that future generations are going to have to be able to repackage these wastes and to look after them properly. Monitored and retrievable storage is necessary. More packaging, which is well labeled and which is able to be repackaged. And most importantly, number 4, away from major water bodies, so that we don't contaminate the very lifeblood of the world. And also number 5, no imports or exports without full consultation with those involved and the territories that would be involved in such movement of radioactive materials. Here is a resolution that was passed in 2018 against small modular reactors. This is the Chiefs of Ontario, but it later was passed by the Assembly of First Nations as well, asking for the nuclear industry to abandon its plans to operate small modular reactors in Ontario and elsewhere, because nuclear reactors, regardless of their size, produce radioactive products and waste material that are potentially toxic and dangerous to human health for thousands of years, and not just human health, the health of all living things, really. Now, today there was an article in the Cress. That picture is from the article. Waste headed for Ontario site is a radioactive mishmash. Nuclear industry veterans warn. These scientists from the Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, who are complaining about the irresponsible placement of long-lived radioactive waste right beside the Ottawa River. Tomorrow, there's going to be a protest with Chief Lance Heyman of the Algonquin, the Kebawak Algonquin First Nation, and there will be a press conference in Ottawa as well. I think this will make it into the national news. The main point here is that the Canadian Nuclear Laboratories wants to build a 7-story high radioactive dump containing radioactive waste and other toxic waste, just 1 kilometer from the Ottawa River, with radioactive materials that will last for more than 100,000 years. And yet the lifetime of the facility to be monitored is only 500 years. 99% of the radioactivity is imported from commercial ventures and includes highly radioactive cobalt-60. So in fact, this one facility, which is currently being proposed and has already been approved, violates all 5 of the principles that I just referred to from the Anishinaabe-Iroquois Alliance. Here's a picture of the Chalk River Nuclear Laboratories. the wonderful, powerful Ottawa River, which flows down through the nation's capital and then down to Montreal, where it joins the St. Lawrence River. It's a major tributary. And this is where they want to put this enormous waste mound. They call it a mound. Right across the river is Quebec, and 140 Quebec municipalities, including the city of Montreal, have expressed strong opposition to this project. Nevertheless, it has been approved by the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. There are 3 legal challenges going forward at the present time. One from non-Indigenous people, one from Indigenous people on the grounds of the failure of the Crown to live up to its mandated responsibility to consult and achieve consent from Indigenous people. And the third one is a direct appeal to the Government of Canada to prevent this from going forward. Now, small modular reactors, I think the SMR logo could just as well be read spending money recklessly, because there's a lot of federal money going into this. So far, it's only a trickle, but it's going to be an awful lot more as things proceed. It turns out that the private investors are not eager to invest in nuclear because of past history. There's been a lot of big losses in the past, and so government money is essential. And the status of the nuclear industry is something that's very important for us to understand in order to see where we are in the grand scheme of things. It turns out that the nuclear industry worldwide has actually been pretty well stagnant for the last 25 years. This is a chart from the World Nuclear Association. And it shows that in 1996, there were 438 reactors in operation worldwide. In 2019, there were almost the same number, only 4 more, only a net increase of 4 reactors. New ones were built, of course, but old ones were also shut down. And the actual contribution of nuclear power to global energy, to global electricity, has declined from 17% of global electricity 25 years ago to less than 10% of global electricity today. And in fact, remember, electricity is not the whole picture, because it's only one slice of the energy pie. So it's about 20%. So if you take 17% of that 20%, it's less than 3.3% of global energy originally, back in 25 years ago. And now it's down to less than 2%. So nuclear power has been in a state of sharp decline, and this decline is expected to continue. Nobody is actually anticipating a large turnaround in the foreseeable future. Most of the reactors now operating are quite old, and there will be a lot of them shut down in the coming years. So the first nuclear renaissance took place in 2001. Now, this phrase, nuclear renaissance, was coined by the nuclear industry to give the impression that the world was going to completely turn around on nuclear power and start buying, and building. And this was about big reactors, not small ones. They wanted to build, and they expected that there would be hundreds or even thousands of large reactors constructed around the world. Well, it turns out that that was a bust. There was a litany of failures associated with this plan, and only a handful of large reactors actually got ordered and built. For example, in Finland, they had a reactor which was a French design. It began in 2005, and it was supposed to be finished in just 3 years, but actually the building took 14 years. So it ended up being almost 4 times as long to build as promised, and it cost over 3 times more than estimated. So this was a big shock to those who invest in these things and those who plan for a nuclear renaissance. It simply didn't live up to the expectations. Also, in America, in the USA, south of the border, especially down in the southern states, there were 4 large reactors ordered, and they were the first orders for decades, for 30 years, in fact. The first reactors ordered for 30 years, and they turned out to be extremely expensive as well. In fact, South Carolina abandoned the project of building 2 of these large reactors. Only Georgia continued, and the US federal government had given $8.3 billion in loan guarantees on the financing of the 4 reactors. which experienced so many debts and so many cost overruns that it actually bankrupted Westinghouse Nuclear. So there have been giants in the nuclear industry who have fallen by the wayside as a result of not being able to deliver reactors on time and on budget. Now, at the same time, there was a huge spike in uranium prices based on speculation. Now, I have to say a word here about the uranium prices. Most of the uranium prices are secret. You can't find them by going onto the government website. These are deals that are locked in with purchasers. So all you can see is the uranium spot price. That means if you want to buy uranium now without a contract, without a long-term contract, how much does it cost you? And that went up so high because it was expected that the nuclear renaissance would be a success. But then it collapsed just as quickly when it became apparent that the renaissance was not happening. And that's when, of course, there were big layoffs in Saskatchewan. Thousands of workers were put out of work during that period. As recently as 2019, which is still quite a while ago, but nevertheless, here we're talking about the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, November 2019, looking forward to the prospect of nuclear growth. And they said, quote, the International Atomic Energy Agency, looking ahead to 2050, sees the most optimistic global electricity market share for nuclear as only about 5%, down from 10% today. And in the United States and Europe, it steadily declines to between 3 and 5% of the market, constituting a potential for market failure. So what I'm pointing out to you here is that the nuclear industry is in desperate straits, and they know it. And one of the reasons why they're launching these small nuclear reactors is because they want to get the investment and get the money and get the go-ahead to build more reactors, which they're desperately in need of if they want their industry to survive. We've looked at this situation fairly closely, and we are convinced that this is unlikely to work in the long run, that in fact, these plans to build hundreds or thousands of small modular reactors will probably never come to pass. In other words, this second nuclear renaissance may be just as much of a bust as the first one. Now, if you look at the US Energy Information Administration, that green line going sharply upwards from left to right, that represents renewables. And the nuclear is the red line at the bottom, which shows some increase. This is projected increase up to the year 2050. But you notice by the charts on the right that only renewables are increasing their share of electricity. And renewables are going from 15% to 28%. Everything else is either staying put or declining, including nuclear. So it's renewables which are really growing very, very rapidly. And in fact, the International Energy Agency has predicted that globally, 90% of all new electricity production facilities in the world over the next 5 years will be renewable. Now, here's I apologize for all these charts. They're not very pleasant to look at, but what this is a comparison of costs from an investment firm called Lazard, the levelized cost of energy comparison. They're the ones that advise investors as to what is the best, where's the best place to put your money. And you will notice that the most expensive renewables in this chart, wind plus storage and solar plus storage, are less expensive than the cheapest feasible nuclear reactors. So the highest end of the renewables cost with storage is considerably less than the lowest end of the nuclear cost. And this is one of the reasons why renewables are going to beat the pants off nuclear. And they are doing so right now, and they're going to continue to do so. Now, at COP28, this is the climate change hearing that took place in late 2023. There were two proposals put forward. One of them was to triple renewable energy and double energy efficiency by 2030. And this is considered by all the experts who've looked at it as being quite doable, especially since China managed to achieve its renewables target 6 years earlier than predicted. So renewables are actually being built faster than predicted. Nuclear is always being built slower than predicted. The other proposal was to triple nuclear power by 2050. That's, of course, 20 years later. But that is considered by many people to be literally impossible. That of the 117 countries that supported number one, there were only 22 countries that supported number two. And number one was adopted by the COP conference. Number two was not adopted. So in fact, officially coming out of the COP conference, we have a commitment globally to triple renewables and double efficiency by 2030, not to triple nuclear power by 2050. So the second triad of nuclear renaissance is small modular nuclear reactors, little typo there. And one could say that this is really either opportunism in the sense that nuclear sees a way of using the climate emergency to say, hey, you need nuclear, you should invest in nuclear, you should give us money. And that's what it really is too, a money grab. The industry knows that there's going to be trillions of dollars on the table around the world to fight climate change. And they say, we should grab as much of that as we can because we have a non-carbon emitting technology here and we believe in it. And maybe you could also say that for the nuclear industry, it may be in fact a last chance because as I indicated earlier, even with the Society of Engineers, there's a danger that they are just going to lose their market viability if they don't turn things around somehow. So from the point of view of my organization, Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility, or CCNR, we believe that small modular nuclear reactors are not clean, not small, not green, not affordable. And you notice that in order to promote these reactors, they do not mention those things that make nuclear power undesirable. There's virtually nothing said about radioactive waste by the promoters or by the government that is supporting them. There's nothing said about major reactor accidents or meltdowns, and there's nothing said about the spread of nuclear weapons through expanding nuclear power. These are all major drawbacks of nuclear power as an energy source, and yet they're not even mentioned in the promotional literature. In fact, they even dropped the word nuclear out of the name small modular nuclear reactors. They just use SMR. Where did the N go? Small modular nuclear reactors should be SMNR. But they leave that word nuclear out because it calls attention to the very thing that makes these reactors undesirable. And that's the nuclear part of it. Because without the nuclear part, you wouldn't have radioactive waste, you wouldn't have the danger of catastrophic accidents, you wouldn't have the risk of proliferation of nuclear weapons. That's where all the problems really lie. Of course, here is a table from the Natural Resources Department of the Canadian government, the Canadian Small Modular Reactor Roadmap. And you can see that they just want to put these reactors all over the place if they can do so, because this would allow them to say that they're doing something to fight climate change. On the other hand, if they can't build these things as quickly as they say they can, if things are going to go as slow as has been the experience up to now, then this is going to be a bust. They're not going to, instead of fighting climate change, they're just going to be kicking the can down the road and accomplishing very little. So that's what we're facing right now. So the elephant in the room is nuclear waste, the root of all problems connected with nuclear power. All fission reactors create radioactive waste. And by the way, normally when we talk about waste, we often think of the leftovers. For example, you make a dress and you cut out some of the material and you get scraps, and those are the leftovers. Well, that's not what nuclear waste is. Radioactive waste is not just left over. It was never there in the first place. It is created inside the nuclear reactor. In fact, there are hundreds of brand new radioactive poisons which are created inside the nuclear fission reactor that were never there before, and in fact were never seen in nature prior to 1939 when nuclear fission was discovered. So, of course, it all comes back to uranium, and that's what brings the Northwest Territories and Northern Saskatchewan particularly into play, because oftentimes Northern Saskatchewan is described as the Saudi Arabia of uranium. in the sense that they're sitting on so much uranium that's fairly close to the surface, and therefore not terribly expensive to mine compared with some other places. But uranium is very special. It is the key element behind all nuclear fission technology. Without uranium, there would be no nuclear weapons of any description, nor would there be any nuclear fission reactors of any description. They all ultimately depend upon uranium. Now, there is another material called plutonium, which can be used to make nuclear weapons and is used to make nuclear weapons. But plutonium does not exist in nature. It's a uranium derivative. It is created from uranium inside a nuclear reactor. So here's what happens, and a little bit technical here, but it's important to understand what's going on inside the reactor. What is nuclear fission? It turns out that there's a special kind of uranium, the lighter isotope, the lighter than the heavier one. It's called uranium-235. And when a neutron, a subatomic projectile, hits one of these uranium atoms, it can start a nuclear chain reaction. And the way it does this is by splitting that uranium atom. And at that moment, it releases a lot of energy. This is called nuclear energy because it comes from the nucleus of the atom. And the results are poisonous materials, which are highly radioactive, called fission products. And those fission products are what make the radioactive waste, what make the nuclear waste so radioactive. But in addition to these fission products, there are also extra neutrons. And those extra neutrons are important because they go on to trigger more fissions and create what's called a nuclear chain reaction. And they also go on to create new radioactive materials by a process I'll describe a little later called activation. So what is radioactivity? Radioactivity is a radioactive element. It's a property of materials. It's not an invisible thing. It's a property of certain materials which have unstable atoms. For a radioactive material, unlike most of the materials that we experience every day, the atoms are literally unstable and they are inclined to explode. And when they explode, they give off shrapnel, subatomic shrapnel, called atomic radiation. And that's what does the harm to living things. Because inside the body, if you have some of these materials in your body because of the food you eat or the water you drink, then those explosions take place inside your body and they can damage cells. And those cells that are damaged can grow in an incorrect way. And oftentimes they may result in cancer. And if they don't result in cancer, there's a bunch of other illnesses that can be caused as well. One of them is a impairment of the immune mechanism, which makes you more susceptible to a host of communicable diseases. So radioactivity is a form of nuclear energy that simply cannot be shut off. Nobody knows how to stop these radioactive emissions. That's why we have a nuclear waste problem. That's why we have to keep these radioactive materials locked away from the human environment basically forever. Now, there's three types of emissions. There's a gamma ray, which is like an X-ray, very penetrating, but more powerful than an X-ray. Then there's an alpha particle, which is like a beta particle, which is like a subatomic bullet. It's not a ray. It's not a radiation, strictly speaking. It's actually a particle that's emitted, and it has much less penetrating power. It only penetrates a few centimeters. An alpha particle is even less penetrating. It's like a subatomic cannonball. It's slightly penetrating, but highly damaging. And by the way, alpha radiation is the main hazard associated with uranium mining. The radon gas gives off alpha radiation. The uranium itself gives off alpha radiation. The polonium and the radium, they all give off alpha radiation. Alpha radiation is particularly hazardous inside the body. It's harmless outside the body. Now, here's a lump of uranium ore in a device called a cloud chamber. And the amazing thing is, you can see these emissions taking place before your very eyes as it leaves tracks. And the amazing thing is that this rock will continue to give off those emissions 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for millions of years without any visible abatement. And it's astonishing that so much energy can be locked up in a rock. And it's the Einstein equation E equals mc squared, which explains how an enormous amount of energy can be released from a very tiny amount of matter through nuclear energy. Here is a picture, an ad from the Canadian Nuclear Association. He's holding up a simulated uranium fuel pellet, and he's saying, small wonder, isn't it wonderful how this small uranium fuel pellet will deliver as much energy as a carload of coal. And so that's the main advantage of nuclear power. It's highly concentrated energy, and it's therefore leaves a smaller footprint. And also, it does not give off carbon dioxide when it releases its energy because it's a different process. There's no combustion and therefore no carbon dioxide. Those are the advantages of nuclear. But what he doesn't tell you in this ad is that once you use this pellet to release energy, you have to keep an eye on it for the next 10 million years because it becomes far too dangerous to throw away. In fact, it becomes one of the most dangerous objects on Earth. One of those fuel bundles, if it came out of a reactor after being used, would kill any human being within 20 seconds at a distance of 1 meter, simply from the blast of gamma radiation. The used fuel ends up being millions of times more radioactive than the fresh fuel. And the reason for that is because it's now loaded with fission products, those new things that were created by the splitting of the uranium atom. They're actually broken pieces of uranium atoms. So there are 3 categories of radioactive waste materials, and this is true for small modular reactors as well. Any fission reactor produces the same kind of waste. There are 3 categories of radioactive waste materials created in the reactor: fission products, which are the broken bits of uranium atoms; transuranics, these are heavier than uranium elements, which are very toxic, including plutonium, americium, curium, and about 36 of them altogether. And then there's another thing which I want to talk about a bit. It's called activation products. These are absorbing stray neutrons, makes non-radioactive materials radioactive. And that's a 3rd category, which I'd like to talk to you about, because there's no plan for dealing with those. At the moment, there's no plan for dealing with those activation products, which are left behind even after the irradiated fuel is removed from the reactor. So here's a list of, from the nuclear industry itself, of 211 radioactive materials that are newly created. Most of them are newly created, not all of them, inside the reactor itself. And it's a list that goes on, and all of these things are radioactive poisons. And after this list of 211 of them, it's important to realize that it's by no means a complete list. It's just a list of those ones that are most prominent. So you can see the problem here. The problem is that you have hundreds of new materials, all of them having their own pathways through the environment and through the human body. And what damage they do depends upon their chemistry as well as their radioactivity, because the chemistry determines where it goes in the body, and then the disintegration of the atoms, the explosion of the atoms, does the damage to the cells. So the main categories that are in the fuel itself that is removed from the reactor at the end of its lifetime are the fission products and the so-called transuranic elements, the ones that are heavier than uranium. But that doesn't account for the activation products. The activation products are due to neutrons that escape from the core of the reactor and collide with the structural materials surrounding the core. The steel, the concrete, even the water, even the air becomes radioactive by exposure to neutrons. And that means that these materials, these structural materials, can never be recycled for other uses. They have to be treated as permanent radioactive waste. So some people have said that nuclear power is the ultimate in the throwaway society. It takes some of the best materials you can find, the highest quality stainless steel, and turns it into radioactive waste that can never be recycled or reused. So when a stray neutron is absorbed by a non-radioactive atom, the result is very often a slightly heavier radioactive atom. That's called an activation product. And that's why when water is activated, you get radioactive tritium. It's chemically identical to ordinary hydrogen, but it's radioactive. Air is activated and produces radioactive carbon-14. Even the structural materials in the core area of the reactor become radioactive waste and are dangerous for tens of thousands of years. Steel, concrete, zirconium, and other materials cannot be recycled, but have to be stored as radioactive waste. Here are some examples. So even after the irradiated fuel is removed from the reactor, and this goes for small as well as large reactors. Here's for a CANDU reactor. Workers have to be protected because the thermal shield would give you, without protection, it would give you death in 5.5 seconds to be in contact with it. The calandria shell, death in 29 seconds. The dump tank, which is where they dump the heavy water, which has now become radioactive, death in 2 minutes. Pressure tube, each pressure tube inside the reactor, there's hundreds of them, death in 28 minutes. That's why the nuclear utilities say that we should wait for at least 40 years before even trying to dismantle these reactors. Because if you wait for 40 years, much of the worst radioactivity will die down and it'll be safer for the workers. It'll be less dangerous if you wait for the radioactivity to die down. This will also be true for small modular reactors as well. Here are some of the long-lived activation products. Some of these things last for actually millions of years. The half-life is the time it takes for half of the material to disappear, but it takes 10 half-lives for 99% of it to disappear. And those 10 half-lives take you up into millions of years. That means we have a permanent problem. Now, here's the difficulty is that if they build small modular reactors all over Canada, then it's going to be very tempting not to remove those radioactive structures, but simply to bury them where they are. And in fact, they're already doing that with two reactors, two small reactors back east, one of them in Manitoba, actually, at White Shell, one of them in Chalk River. They're actually trying to bury those radioactive entrails of the nuclear reactors right where they are, right beside major rivers. And if they build a lot of small modular reactors around Canada, then every place there's a small modular reactor is likely to become a permanent radioactive waste dump, which will be a danger for future generations, countless future generations to come, unless they decide that they're going to dismantle those reactors, despite the danger, and carry those radioactive materials somewhere else, but they have no place to put it. So chances are they're going to stay where they are. This is a real downside of small modular reactors that everyone should be well aware of. So SMRs are not clean. They produce radioactive waste of all kinds. Fission products are more concentrated when they use more enriched uranium. They're using enriched uranium for these reactors. What that means is that the U-235 is more concentrated, and the U-235 is what splits and gives you the fission products. So the more U-235 there is in the fuel, the more radioactive it becomes at the end of its lifetime. And there's also more neutron leakage because of the smallness. When you shrink down the core of the reactor to a small size, that means more neutrons are able to escape and create more activation products. There's an article by the National Academy of Sciences which says it could be up to 30 times more radioactivity produced in these small reactors than in the large ones. How's my time? Is I up to the 5-minute limit yet?
3 more minutes.
3 more minutes. Okay, I'll try and finish this off. So all fission reactors can cause a radioactive catastrophe, because what a radioactive catastrophe is simply releasing those materials into the environment. And that can happen by warfare, that can happen by industrial accident, by explosion. In Ukraine, we've seen the threat of Russia actually exploding one of the reactors in Ukraine. That would be a disaster. It would be a man-made disaster, and it would release more radioactivity even than was released in the existing meltdowns that we've experienced in other places. Even a small reactor, like this is the Fermi 1 reactor, it only produces 69 megawatts of electricity. That's a very small reactor. It's smaller than any of the ones that are currently being planned in Canada of the SMRs. And yet it underwent a partial meltdown in 1966, as told in the book, We Almost Lost Detroit. So there's complications for the small modular reactor waste. When they try and put it underground, there's further complications as to, it's not going to be a simple matter to bury this stuff. It's going to be much harder to bury it than it is to bury the CANDU fuel for technical reasons. In addition, all fission reactors do create nuclear explosive materials, and that means that people if we start scattering these reactors around the world, it means that many countries which right now do not have nuclear weapons will for the first time have access to plutonium from which you can make nuclear weapons. And that's because inside the reactor, there's uranium-238 atoms which get hit with a neutron and get turned into plutonium-239, which is the primary nuclear explosive, the most commonly used nuclear explosive in the world today. Doesn't exist in nature, plutonium. It's only created in nuclear reactors, small or large. Here's how much plutonium you need to destroy a city. That glass ball is exactly the same size as the plutonium ball that was used in the Nagasaki bomb and killed hundreds of thousands of people. In India, we gave a small nuclear reactor, a small one, only 40 megawatts of heat, and they used that reactor to produce their first atomic bomb explosion in 1974. So that was a Canadian reactor that we gave them as a gift, and they used it for that purpose. Now, the only thing that prevents people from easily making a bomb from the reactor spent fuel is I use the word firewall, and my friend Bob Del Tredici wrote a wall. He actually drew a wall of fire to indicate that there's a barrier that prevents the bomb makers from using the stuff directly. Why? Because the spent fuel is so radioactive, it'll kill anybody who tries to handle it. So therefore, they built a reprocessing plant. A reprocessing plant is a facility to separate the plutonium so that it can be reused as fuel for nuclear reactors by going out the front door, but it can also go out the back door and be used to make bombs. And that's the danger of spreading nuclear reactors around the world. You're actually giving people the first leg up to making their own nuclear arsenal of bombs. So I'm going to, I think my time is up. Am I right?
Yes,
I'm
yes,
just
you are.
I'm just going to finish by saying SMRs are not always small. Here's a small modular reactor called the BWRX-300 planned for the Darlington, Ontario site, but that's already 11 stories high. And when you look closer, you find out that the actual back end of it goes 12 stories below ground. So altogether, it's 23 stories high. And that's called a small modular reactor. Well, you can see that there's a lot of dishonesty going on when people are describing these things as small and giving people the impression that you can just put them on a truck and take them to a location and plop them down there. That's not the case at all. There are some reactors like the E. Vinci reactor, which are more entitled to be called small reactors, but we'll deal with that another day, perhaps. I think the E. Vinci reactor is something they're talking about in Saskatchewan. And in fact, $80 million has been given to the Saskatchewan Research Council to actually study the E. Vinci reactor. It's a lot smaller than this one, but it was developed by the Army for military purposes. And I think you should be very careful to find out what is the whole truth behind that reactor as well. Thank you very much for your patience, and I will sign off now.
Thank you very much, Dr. Edwards. I think you led into a very important point about governments and actually dirty energy companies that want people to believe that nuclear power is necessary to reduce greenhouse gases and to avert a climate crisis. So that's the selling point they're using. And the information you're providing us tonight is really showing how, they don't know what they're doing or what they're talking about. And they're want to produce million years waste management for to save the climate that they've destroyed. So thank you for sharing that with us. So we're going to move on and join our guest, Benjamin Ralston. He's an assistant professor at the College of Law, University of Saskatchewan. Some of his research areas include Aboriginal rights, Canadian constitutional law, environmental law, human rights law, and natural resource law. Benjamin has worked at the University of Saskatchewan in various capacities since 2014, including for the first year in the Nunavut Law program. He taught law courses, and now I'm going to do my best to say this, in the Conaway Hatan ASCII program for Indigenous land managers, and continues to teach a graduate course on environmental law and policy for the School of Environment and Sustainability. He's completing his PhD at the College of Law with a dissertation investigating the intersection between environmental assessment practices and Indigenous rights in Canada. He joins us tonight to discuss this. Miigwech and welcome, Benjamin.
Great. Thank you for having me. And I'm very happy to be following Dr. Edwards. I can't purport to be an expert in the science of nuclear reactors. I know now more than I did 30, 40 minutes ago. My own expertise is in the legal environment, obviously, teaching here at a law school. And so what I'm going to focus on are some of the legal considerations that go into the business model or the proposals for small modular nuclear reactors, and kind of focus on that piece, essentially trying to tease out how deregulation or the dilution of regulation for nuclear power production is an integral part of the business model for the deployment of SMRs, and then also exploring some of the ways we're already seeing this come down the pipe here in Canada. Oops. So first, let me start with just a bit of the buzz around SMRs. So some of the, I guess, arguments that are being used by proponents for these projects. It's not surprising if you've only recently heard about SMRs. For those of us outside of a very specialized body of knowledge about nuclear power production, I'd say over the past decade, small modular reactors or SMRs have gone from a relatively niche area of study to effectively a household name. So you'll often see news media coverage about this. There are, of course, consultation processes happening, studies with government funding and industry funding trying to build up awareness, but also shape public opinions on this topic right now. So proponents of nuclear power are arguing that SMRs are going to be some sort of panacea to solve various challenges for the industry. And so one key piece that we're seeing here in Saskatchewan would be the problem that the size of existing nuclear power plants had in terms of accessing certain markets, where either there was too small of an energy grid or there's no energy grid whatsoever, right? So part of the big pitch for SMRs here in Saskatchewan, as well as in more remote regions of Northern Saskatchewan, Northern Alberta, Nunavut, and elsewhere, is the idea that this can kind of turn nuclear power into some sort of smaller modular units that can be used in remote locations, areas with smaller energy grids. So this could be added to the grid for Saskatchewan, but it could also be used associated with mining, could be oil sands production, that sort of thing, in locations that wouldn't have a grid tie-in. Proponents say that these are going to be capable of providing more affordable nuclear energy, in part through what you can think of as almost like the IKEA-fication of nuclear energy. And what I mean by that is a sort of IKEA-type model of having simpler designs and then effectively the economy of mass production, so that you have, the parts put together, developed en masse, and then deployed en masse, rather than having something custom created. You could imagine custom furniture developed by a carpenter is going to be a lot more expensive than the do-it-yourself, put it together at home IKEA furniture you might order. And another big piece is the theory of a smaller footprint for these power generation facilities as well. So the modular in SMRs, what we're talking about is modularization in the sense of mass production of their structures, their systems, and their components, prefabrication of these units. So they're being constructed and manufactured in one location, and then they're being shipped and assembled on site for where they're inevitably being deployed. So in terms of the economics, this modular approach is supposed to allow for lower initial capital investment. So I think if you're comparing these to larger nuclear reactors, it is a more expensive, in generalities, form of power production because they're smaller size. But the theory is that you can start small with maybe one unit and then gradually scale up. So that's the scalability piece, right? Where you get perhaps 1 or 2 units installed, and as power needs grow, more units get added on through the delivery of more of these modules. And then there's the siting flexibility piece, right? So it's traditionally very challenging to find anywhere where a large nuclear reactor would be viable. It's one of the reasons why, while Ontario has a lot of power production from nuclear energy, it's effectively non-existent through Western Canada, and this is essentially part of the new business model of making it something that can fit in these smaller sites. In Canada, one of the key arguments for SMRs is that it will be an alternative to diesel generators for mines, and it will be used for remote northern communities. So Indigenous communities are not just one potential target for the deployment of SMRs, but are a major part of not just the business case, but also the political case for this. So we have a strange consensus between the federal government and certain provincial governments that might have very different politics right now when it comes to SMRs. But it's also likely that they may have different ideas as to how they might be deployed or where they might fit into the overall energy mix. But certainly northern communities and then resource extraction activities are at the front line of the thinking in this regard. North America more broadly, we can see this both in proposals in the United States and justification for the subsidization of SMRs in the US, but the same has been proposed here in Saskatchewan, for instance, talking about possibly siting an SMR facility in the Estevan area. In theory, these are being pitched as potentially an option to replace coal-fired electricity in grids for baseload power, right? So it's one of these political pushback points for green energy in Saskatchewan is that we are a province with not so many people and a lot of industrial uses of energy. And what that means is in terms of a push for renewable energy, we don't have a sort of natural cycle of when people are maximizing their energy use, which normally would be relatively closely associated with when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing, as opposed to industrial uses that will require power 24/7. That's where we have at least the political pushback in Saskatchewan and Alberta against more rapidly adopting renewables and phasing out fossil fuel power generation. And so this is being pitched as an alternative to that. So rather than bringing more natural gas energy production online or extending the lifespan of coal-fired electricity, these will just be swapped out with SMR facilities. Significant investments are being made by governments, and this is where we get a sort of potential conflict of interest situation, because this is all essentially very theoretical or future-oriented. And so governments, including Canada's, the United States, South Korea, China, Russia, across the world, are all putting lots of investments into SMR development based on the theory that this would be a huge potential market for manufacturing, for other forms of expertise and employment. And so right now, trying to get in on the ground floor to be first movers in this market is creating essentially a race to fund and get some of these up and constructed. So there's over 80 different designs that exist, but only a handful of SMRs actually exist in the world or are under construction. We're talking Russia, China, and then at least one example under construction in Argentina. But we've got provinces that are pushing very fast to try and get in line to bring SMR technology online as soon as 2029, 2030 as a target date. So from a legal perspective, one of the important pieces is that the business case or the economic case for SMRs is very closely related to questions about the regulation of nuclear energy generation. So you've got a tight coupling, if you will, between a push to deregulate nuclear power production, or at least dilute the regulation of nuclear power production so as to allow for SMRs to be deployed. And there becomes kind of a game of scale in terms of trying to make the case for SMRs as exceptions to the general rules applied to larger nuclear power facilities. So licensing for nuclear reactors has already long proven to be costly and time-consuming for large reactors. And what we have with the coming of these SMRs with 80 plus different models being proposed is all sorts of novel features, untested technologies, design features that are different from what regulators are used to with existing nuclear power reactors. And from a regulatory perspective, what this means is that there are fewer rule books for regulators to work from, right? It could be new forms of cooling, other mechanisms, you know, the burying of these SMRs as some sort of, I guess, attempt to reduce the risk of fallout event. These are all features that, to the degree they're unprecedented, the regulators can't simply look to existing studies of real life reactors and use that as a basis for proposing mitigation conditions or deciding what to approve and what not to approve going forward. So what you have is a tension where the proponents of these small modular reactors, they know that already part of the business case for large nuclear reactors being a poor one has to do with the complexity and the time span required for regulatory review. And so what the proponents have been arguing is that they should essentially be able to have more streamlined or less intensive forms of regulatory review to offset the expense and time that'll be associated with these regulatory reviews and licensing processes, in part based on the idea that these new technologies will simply be designed in ways that are inherently safer. So, for example, one big part of this has to do with what's called the emergency planning zone, or the EPZ, or EPZ, if you will, for SMRs, where SMR proponents are arguing that their technology is different. These units are smaller, they might be buried, they might have other fail-safe mechanisms that don't require the same geographic area for emergency planning purposes in the event of a significant nuclear accident. And so this is effectively the geographic area in which various emergency measures must be planned for in the event of severe, accidents is what I meant to write there. And so they're arguing for a dramatic reduction of that so that these can be sited in a broader variety of areas, including areas like former coal power plants that would not otherwise be geographically or legally viable for a large nuclear power plant. So some countries are continuing to plan for traditional EPZs, or emergency protection zones. And under international law, the usual framing for that is 5 kilometers up to 25 kilometers as a radius around, you could imagine, a circle surrounding nuclear power facilities. But many of these SMR proponents are arguing that they should have much smaller EPZs, right? You've got a smaller reactor, you've got supposedly modular technology that allows for a reduction of this regulatory piece, some arguing for as low as 1,000 feet as the area around the reactor where there needs to be a plan in case of emergencies. And this isn't just a sort of peripheral issue for SMRs, but for many SMR proponents, this is key to what they're proposing in terms of market access, right? So the existing location of things like retired coal plants in the United States and Canada, inherently you have locations that are geographically not suitable in many cases for the typical exclusion zone or emergency protection or planning zone of a large nuclear power plant. And so by reducing that EPZ area, you can modularly slip these into pre-existing infrastructure. There are other questions about cogeneration, ideas that perhaps these small modular reactors could also provide industrial heat, for instance, but all of that requires locations much nearer to population centers. And so it's a big part of the business case that not only can these provide electricity for smaller grids like Saskatchewan's, but they can also be located geographically much closer to people. Reducing these requirements for SMRs is also seen as key for utilities. So those who would purchase these models, in order to have a strong business case for SMRs, The utility concern is that there needs to be less cost and complexity when it comes to planning for emergency responses. So within those EPZs, you effectively have a need for the operator to conduct emergency response drills, to have emergency sirens in place, to have all sorts of staffing related to an emergency response in an area that could be as large as 25 kilometers radius around, possibly intersecting with all sorts of other geographic uses, if you will. SMR proponents also make a very common argument that you may have heard before among other resource developers, and it's essentially that overly prescriptive regulation limits innovation. And so we've heard this a lot across the resource development industries throughout Canada, that effectively when government regulations are too prescriptive as to what must be done and how it must be done, it makes it very hard to innovate and come up with newer, better technologies because all of those newer, better technologies are going to require rethinking of the regulatory rules. And it's often simpler and more certain for companies to just build within the existing regulation, but then this effectively locks in technology. So hopefully I've explained that well, but effectively where the way in which the government regulates an industry freezes them in time as to the way in which they conduct themselves so that they maintain all of their equipment, their facilities, their infrastructure, and their practices within those regulatory limits. So what we've often heard and seen movements towards, especially in provinces like Saskatchewan and British Columbia, is a move towards what's sometimes called outcomes-based regulation or performance-based regulation. There are a few different other ways of phrasing essentially the same thing, where there's a more open-ended approach to regulation, allowing companies through professionals to propose very new ways of maintaining safety that then can be looked at for adequacy by the regulator. But of course, the question becomes the more ad hoc or the more diverse the approaches for safety and regulation become, the less capacity government has to actually audit and test all of these different proposals being put to them. So in terms of SMR design, we have seen some kind of freezing or locking in of existing models based on existing regulations. And perhaps the most obvious example would be a focus on light water reactors in the US when it comes to the design of the SMRs. And it relates to the fact that large-scale nuclear power generation is also generally light water reactors in North America. And so trying to model the smaller version as closely as possible on the pre-existing technology so that it's familiar to the regulators, with the idea that that will speed up the approval process. The theory being that if new regulations have to be created in response to technological innovations, what this will mean is that the licensing processes end up being drawn out, where there's a longer process for the regulator to get themselves up to speed. There has to be more information flows from the proponent and in this case, the designer of the facility and the government regulator to make sure they're all on the same page. You also have a situation where processes for public participation can become more heated, where there's consultation processes or options for members of the public to become interveners in environmental assessments, for instance. The more novel the technology and the less information there is to back up that technology, the more likely that you'll have members of the public putting forward hard questions for the regulator as well as the regulated proponent as well. And then this opens a whole other can of worms about litigation, where the results of those public participation processes can be lawsuits over the inadequacy of the regulatory process. It could be duty to consult litigation, as it would often be the case in Canada, for instance. And so from the SMR proponent perspective, this is their nightmare scenario, which is the full regulatory proceedings, full environmental assessment, followed by lawsuits flowing in part from the untested nature of their technologies. And so within this framing, essentially what we have is the proponents for these small modular reactors pushing very hard for more flexible approaches to regulation that can accommodate their supposed added safety in design. But you have an inherent tension between these things where they're proposing that these products, through adaptations that they've made, are more inherently safer, have more fail-safe mechanisms or more elements designed into them that will prevent nuclear disasters. But at the same time, they're also seeking and lobbying very hard for a reduction in the existing level of regulation for nuclear power facilities that could potentially cancel out some, if not all, of the added safety benefits from the design side. Another big piece as far as the SMRs go is with so few and only recent examples of this technology actually being built and existing on the ground, it creates an informational gap for regulators to work from. And so what we've seen in terms of the very kind of preliminary but forward-looking investments being made into SMR research is a lot of funding of academic research that in part can kind of circumvent those gaps by creating an abundance of peer-reviewed literature that can then feed into the regulatory review processes. But of course, there's all sorts of questions that arise and that we have to grapple with in universities when it comes to industry funding for academic research and how to maintain the objectivity and integrity of that research. Many of SMR's purported strengths can also be weaknesses from a regulatory perspective as well. So there's a kind of a finicky balancing here if you're able to look beyond the more kind of industry hype, if you will. One issue is that SMRs are found to be less efficient than large nuclear reactors, and they've been found to create more waste, or they're predicted to create more waste where they don't yet exist. And this has logistical issues for nuclear proliferation, as Dr. Edwards pointed to. So we're talking about the IKEAification of nuclear power generation, and the economics of that only work if these are deployed in hundreds or thousands of units, right? It's not, the business model doesn't work if there are only a few dozen being deployed. And so if part of SMR deployment means that there will be lots of these SMR units, they'll be deployed in large quantities, and part of the business model is that they're going to be deployed in remote areas where diesel electricity generation might be the status quo. This creates all sorts of security questions for nuclear proliferation, right? So the need for some sort of military or security response to avoid access to these waste materials for nuclear weapons becomes logistically a lot more challenging when you're talking about having these units all over the place, including in a lot of very remote, hard to monitor regions. There have already been cybersecurity issues in relation to nuclear power generation in certain countries. And there's another concern that, again, with the proliferation of SMRs, if they are deployed en masse, that there will be concerns about added vulnerability to cybersecurity attacks, and especially where these have been proposed to be operated off-site rather than having a sort of larger nuclear power generation with an on-site crew managing those issues. There becomes a whole other can of worms in terms of safe transportation of modular units and the waste that they produce to and from more remote locations, as opposed to the relatively more connected locations for traditional large reactors, right? So again, these aren't being constructed on site, they're being installed on site, but the modularity of them is that they're being prefabricated and then delivered to their ultimate destination. And so we heard from Dr. Edwards that there may be a real risk of those wastes being maintained on site, but even to the degree that they're being taken off site, it raises whole other logistical and legal questions about how to safely and legally do so. So Another example we can see in this tension between regulation and the economics of SMRs that I think is very palpable comes down to the capping of compensation in the case of some sort of nuclear disaster. And so many areas of environmental regulation, you'll have industry pushing for limits on the amount of compensation that can flow from an environmental disaster, or coming up with other tools or strategies to try and reduce the risk that they face of having to pay out, an unending number of lawsuits in an Exxon Valdez type situation. And so up until 2017, Canada had a legislated compensation cap of $75 million for liability in the event of a nuclear incident. And this was something that the nuclear industry had lobbied for, in part to facilitate their ability to access insurance for large reactors to operate in Canada, but also, again, part of the business model that they claimed that they needed this very relatively low limit on compensation in order for these projects to be viable and operable in practice. In 2017, we had in part related to a change in federal government and some moves to try and reform environmental law in this country, a new piece of legislation came into play called the Nuclear Liability and Compensation Act. And so this was meant to bring Canada closer in line with best practices internationally in terms of the maximum amount of compensation that could be paid out if there was a Chernobyl or Fukushima type nuclear disaster. And so it initially went from 75 million all the way up to 650 million, I believe it was, or 675, whatever the case was. It had a transition period, but as of some point in 2020, $1 billion became the new cap for compensation for a nuclear incident, right? So on its face, much higher than 75 million. So sounds like progress in terms of having some sort of viable accountability measures in the case of nuclear accidents. However, the Nuclear Liability and Compensation Act does have wiggle room for the federal government to lower the liability cap for certain nuclear installations. And in fact, it's part of the federal government's SMR roadmap that they have promised to pass regulations that, at least for some SMRs, are going to set lower compensation limits proportional to the size of these particular power generation facilities. So hopefully I'm making that clear. While we moved from 75 million up to $1 billion in terms of the cap of payouts for those harmed in the case of nuclear disasters, we're seeing potential scaling of that down for these SMRs in the same sort of strategy that the smallness of SMRs should allow for some sort of reduction in the regulatory burden that they face. Another common issue seen for environmental regulation just in general would be when regulators fail to maintain clear boundaries with industry, and where you have the same governmental agency both regulating and promoting an industry. So this isn't specific to the nuclear industry. This was somewhat infamous for the National Energy Board, where you'd have individuals from the oil and gas industry who would be primarily working as the regulators, as the independent adjudicators or panelists to oversee environmental assessments, so on and so forth. You can also see it in the governance of fisheries in Canada, where you might have the federal government through the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, both promoting fish farming while at the same time purporting to protect the fisheries from harm. This has been a long-standing concern as well for the regulation of the nuclear industry in Canada. Now, the CNSC, our federal agency working over the nuclear power generation industry, it doesn't expressly have a dual mandate to promote and regulate the nuclear industry. So since 2000, its enabling statute, or the legislation that empowers it, does limit it to a protective regulatory role. But notably, its predecessor in Canada did have a dual mandate and was expressly mandated by law to both promote and regulate the nuclear industry. And it's at least arguable that you see the same patterns of conduct that continue on through CNSC today, post-2000, regardless of how their statute might read. It's at least arguable that you see a similar kind of problematic dual mandate type behavior where Canada's trying to rush to license SMR designs and get them to construction, while at the same time, they're supposed to be acting in the public interest to ensure that these are regulated in a safe way for the protection of current and future generations. So you've got a situation where on the one hand, Canada and arguably CNSC as well might see themselves as in a race against other countries to become early entrants into the SMR industry, to more quickly approve designs that may then be used for export, and to build up a domestic manufacturing, I guess, industry in Canada. And then at the same time, also trying to manage and determine whether these are in the public interest at all. So like the National Energy Board, CNSC was actually singled out for at least a perception of what's called regulatory capture by an independent expert panel that was tasked with proposing environmental assessment reforms in Canada. And so some changes were made to try and create more distance between CNSC and the running of environmental assessments. And so essentially at our current federal environmental assessment legislation, CNSC would be directly conducting environmental assessments for nuclear-related projects. Now there is a separate agency that would deal with those assessments. But a whole other can of worms has been opened up with the fact that these small modular reactors have been kept out of that federal environmental assessment process in any event, and it's just been left up to CNSC to govern these projects through a lesser form of regulatory review. So the federal SMR roadmap had also identified, at least by 2018, that environmental assessment processes were seen as an impediment and a risk for the viability of this particular industry. Oops. 10 minutes, okay. I've got a little bit of time here. Okay, so we've got a situation where, environmental assessment processes, it's one of the longest and most ubiquitous forms of environmental regulation in the world, but it's also one that tends to be the most resource intensive from a project proponent perspective, and tends to involve the most amount of public scrutiny of a proposal as well. And so this was seen by the proponents of SMR as a potential impediment and risk for them. And they proposed through this roadmap that was adopted by the Canadian government that SMRs should be fully exempt from these processes, right? Again, the fear being that the business case for SMRs only works from their perspective if it's accompanied by some kind of dilution or deregulation, or at least proportionality of regulation from their perspective. Now, environmental assessments are by far the most common process for public-facing scrutiny of environmentally impactful projects. They're seen all over the world. I think there's maybe only 2 or 3 countries, North Korea, Sudan, perhaps that's all, that don't have environmental assessment processes nationally. So it's well accepted, pardon me, as best practice when it comes to scrutinizing environmental impacts for projects, and doing so in a public-facing way that allows for public participation and the sharing of environmental information with members of the public. Nevertheless, Canada, under our current impact assessment regime, created regulations in 2019 that, while they didn't fully exempt all SMRs from the impact assessment process, they set a 200 megawatt thermal threshold, exempting at least the small reactors that fall below that limit. So they essentially set a cap on how big a small modular reactor had to be before it would undergo an environmental assessment process. And what always happens in the regulatory world as a result is once you have those caps, it puts a lot of pressure on project proponents to design their projects to fall under those thresholds so as to design around the regulatory process, if that makes sense. Instead, we have the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, or CNSC, purporting to be able to address regulatory review of these. So there will certainly be some kind of regulatory process. It could have a public consultation component to it, just not to the degree of sophistication and robustness that you would get through the Impact Assessment Act process. And of course, that Federal Impact Assessment Act, albeit facing some challenges in the courts this year and beyond, you have a much larger number of mandatory considerations that are taken into account that did set it apart from any provincial environmental assessment process in terms of its rigor and its kind of objective sophistication, if you will, in terms of things that must be considered, including things like Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous rights, and other impacts on Indigenous peoples. So this will instead be sort of brought into the realm of CNSC to deal with. And they've also found other ways to try and speed up the regulatory process and create more certainty for proponents of SMR designs. One of the tools they've used is what they call the Voluntary Vendor Design Review process, or the VDR process. And essentially what this allows for is companies that are proposing a design for new SMRs to then get a non-binding opinion from CNSC as to their potential compliance with Canadian law, as well as advice on how they might improve upon their design to ensure a more speedy regulatory approval process through CNSC. And so this is in some ways standard fare for environmental law, right? Trying to move away from a reactive approach and trying to ensure that the design of environmentally harmful activities is kind of internalizing environmental impacts and designing to avoid them. But at the same time, you start to see closer and closer connections between CNSC and the nuclear industry that can have all sorts of problems in terms of regulatory capture and the lack of a sort of arm's length between the regulator and the regulated, which notably has been seen as one of the main factors in the Fukushima nuclear disaster. So to see or to try and think of what exactly this might look like in the future going forward, we can look to a recent proposal for a pair of SMRs from Énergie NB Power. So this is New Brunswick's Power Corp at an existing nuclear power generation site at Pointe-le-Preau. So this is a location on the Bay of Fundy in New Brunswick. And you have a situation where SMRs are being put forward at a location where there's already existing nuclear power generation facility. So there are some parts of the regulatory process that will be easier as a result for that SMR proposal. But there are other aspects that probably give us an indication of where things might head if we see similar proposals in Saskatchewan, Alberta, or elsewhere. One of the pieces that came out of this was you had effectively a proposal for two different SMRs, so two different reactors proposed at the same time at the same location, but treated as different units for the purpose of the Impact Assessment Act. And so this is arguably could be an example of what is a common strategy of designing to try and avoid the full scrutiny of an environmental assessment process. It was argued by a citizens group in New Brunswick that this was effectively project splitting, is what they called it. So it's sometimes called project splitting, sometimes also called salami slicing, but it's a common practice where the proponents of projects will try and get individual components of a larger infrastructure assessed individually so that there's lesser forms of scrutiny during environmental assessment. So you can imagine something like a pipeline. If you can separate the pipeline from one part of the pipeline from another part of the pipeline, You might make what would otherwise be a federally assessed project into a provincially assessed one, or there might be a marine terminal for that pipeline. If you can remove that from the project being proposed, you can fall outside of these kind of objective triggers for an environmental assessment process and reduce the cost and public scrutiny of a project as a result. And so suddenly we see the modularity of SMRs potentially being used to avoid regulatory scrutiny by having what would be two different reactors, each of which is small enough in its power production to fall below the regulations under the Impact Assessment Act, so as to avoid the full brunt of a federal environmental assessment. But together, if we were to look at them as one project, and effectively they are in the same location and arguably integrated in a variety of ways, they would potentially have to go through that process instead, leading to all of the delays and higher levels of scrutiny that these proponents are concerned about. Ultimately, the federal government rejected the argument that this was project splitting. They accepted the advice from CNSC that this did not need to go through a full environmental assessment process under the Impact Assessment Act. A provincial environmental assessment will occur. So there is both federal, provincial, and even territorial environmental assessment regimes. Generally speaking, however, the provincial regimes that we see across the country are seen as having less rigor in terms of how much public participation they allow for, the funding opportunities for interveners, Indigenous nations, and others to be involved, and the number of considerations that are mandated for these processes as well. Meanwhile, a whole other concern with being first adopters of new technology like this has come about, where ordinarily utilities are forced to try and provide the best, the most affordable energy as possible for ratepayers, so those who require the energy. And in the case of New Brunswick, because they're an early adopter for SMR technology, they had to amend their legislation to force their utility to purchase power from these SMRs, even where cheaper options exist. And so very open recognition from the provincial government that the power being generated by these small modular reactors will be more expensive in their circumstances, recognizing that to the degree there's any case that they could provide cheaper or competitive power, it comes through the theory that they'll be deployed en masse in a kind of IKEA style, develop it in a factory, deploy it, and then manufacture and install it on site. Okay, that's it from me. Other than that, I've just provided a few sources in the presentation I've distributed to you, so places you could find more information on this. And otherwise, I look forward to perhaps questions for us.
Miigwech, thank you so much, Benjamin. Yeah, it's really heavy material that we're going through, but this is really helpful for us to, resist false solutions by the energy companies that have created these problems that we're all experiencing. And I know for Keepers of the Water, one of the biggest thing, we speak about is the water and the contamination to water. And, one thing that I do want to mention is that uranium minings involve very extensive pump outs of groundwater and excessive in the billions of liters a year in Canada. So, it's not just the, the mining waste that's produced, it's the effects to the landscape, the wildlife, the air impacts and human health, and we're going to cover those soon. We do have some questions from our audience. So I'm going to give the first one, and perhaps you guys can both share the answers with us. So one of the first questions that came from our Facebook viewers was, do the cost for nuclear that we're told about, do they include the long-term waste management?
Oh, are you asking me, or they don't? Actually, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission has refused to consider the cost of a long-term waste management or decommissioning. I mentioned the problem of even when you take the high-level waste out of the reactor, you're still left with a radioactive structure, which is actually quite dangerous for a long period of time, tens of thousands of years. So they have declined to do that, and this is one of the problems with assessing the competitive nature of the technology in relation to, say, renewables, for example. Now, with renewables, everybody knows that there are certain disadvantages of renewables and certain advantages of renewables. The greatest advantage is that it's right now approximately 3 or 4 times cheaper than nuclear. And it's also 3 or 4 times faster to deploy, possibly even more than that, because we assume oftentimes that reactors can be built on schedule. And we've seen that past experience has shown that this is often not the case. That often that, as a matter of fact, in the States, the only small modular reactor intended to be built in North America and receiving all the licensing approvals necessary for that, or at least very close to it, was the NuScale project, where it was going to be built in Idaho. And that was recently canceled because of the cost kept escalating as they proceeded to they hadn't even started construction, but as they proceeded to deal with the various design features, the cost kept going up and up and up, and eventually they had no customers. Now, there's a real problem with this cost issue that what we call the cost of a nuclear reactor given by the vendor is how credible is it? Because oftentimes we've seen the case where the cost can be 3, 4, 5 times higher even than the initial estimate. I mentioned a couple of companies that were bankrupted over those escalating costs, Areva and Westinghouse. So these are serious questions, and they're ones that really call into question the government's wisdom in confusing, you might say, an industrial strategy with a climate change reduction strategy. The difficulty is that if you're really interested in reducing climate change in an urgent fashion, there's little doubt that the fastest and cheapest methods should be used. And the fastest and cheapest methods are not nuclear. So there may be a conflicting motive on the part of the government here. They'd like to promote something that they can sell to other countries. They'd like to promote something that they can build up the industrial base in Canada. But very important to realize that until they have a lot of customers lined up, hundreds or even thousands of customers, they really can't afford to mass produce them. So this idea of mass producing and lowering the cost through mass production can be a kind of a delusion, particularly when we have, as previously mentioned, over 80 designs. That means there's an awful lot of competition. And that means that it's very difficult for any one model to corner the market to a sufficient degree that would justify modularizing, going to that point where you could actually mass produce. As a matter of fact, there was a study done by a couple of researchers at the University of British Columbia on if they installed small modular reactors in all these remote, isolated communities in the north, for example, that would not provide a sufficient basis of customers to justify moving to mass production. So how far do you have to go before you can actually start achieving the benefits of the mass production? Until you do that, they're all going to be first-of-a-kind reactors, FOAK, first of a kind. And those, as previously mentioned by Mr. Belanger, those are likely to be very expensive. It's like making it on-site. You don't have the modularization to begin with.
Thank you. I do have another question from Facebook, and I'm going to give this one to you, Dr. Gordon. Kim asks us, how much plutonium is produced in Canada annually?
Oh boy, I don't have the answer to that offhand, but generally speaking, in a can-do reactor, for example, the amount of plutonium is only 0.54%. 0.5, that's less than 1%, less than almost half of a percent. However, you don't need very much plutonium to make bombs. So they're actually producing, every can-do reactor is producing several bombs worth every year. So, several bombs, if you think of a bomb's worth as being what I was referring to earlier. Now, the International Atomic Energy Agency, by the way, the Nagasaki bomb used approximately 6.2 kilograms of plutonium is what went in to the Nagasaki bomb, the one that destroyed the city of Nagasaki. But because the grade of the plutonium is somewhat coarser from a commercial reactor, the International Atomic Energy Agency sets the amount at 8 kilograms. They say that 8 kilograms is roughly the amount of plutonium from a commercial power reactor that you would need for a bomb. That would still mean that every can-do reactor is producing several bombs worth every year.
That's quite alarming. I would like to give this next question to Benjamin. Is there, and this came from Facebook, is there any actions that we can take to let the federal government know that firstly, we want proper consultation, free, prior, and informed consent? Because like most of Canada doesn't know about this.
Yeah, I mean, it could have been a whole different presentation on consultation and consent from an Indigenous perspective and what it means from a rights-based perspective. I mean, as a lawyer, that's been a lot of my kind of bread and butter when I was pre-academia and practice was working for First Nations on consultation matters. I mean, one tool would be where there are processes. So, for instance, when you had a specific proposal in New Brunswick, there will be, generally speaking, throughout various regulatory regimes, options for public participation. Some are more robust than others, but all of those options are opportunities to provide information, ask for information, and try and shake the government down for its justification. There's other schemes that can be used, like access to information legislation as well. But there is clearly kind of a strategy here in trying to break it up into pieces and kind of front end some of the regulatory burden at a level of abstraction before you have more specific proposals, you know, maybe in Estevan or Elbow, Saskatchewan. I think those are places that have been thrown around in the past in our province. Once it gets to that level, it will be harder to argue about consultation and consent for all sorts of decisions that happen already in terms of funding research, in terms of going through this sort of voluntary vendor design review process and all of that. And so by breaking it up in those pieces, they've certainly made it hard, but there will still be those opportunities. And honestly, I'd say to look broadly at Canada, if litigation is happening over the waste disposal issue in Ontario, that would be something for, I think, other Indigenous nations and environmental organizations to be aware of and possibly get involved in as interveners if need be, just to make sure you're able to kind of put a better picture before the judges in those cases, because those precedents will later be relied on when similar issues emerge in Saskatchewan and elsewhere. I don't know if that quite answers the question, but yeah, there are a number of levers you could pull, so it's hard to point to just one.
Thank you. This is a technical question from Pamela from Facebook. She says that given that SMRs won't have the same firewalls as the bigger reactors, how is this being handled by the regulators?
Well, that firewall that I mentioned is really not just it's a physical prevention. There's the spent fuel, the irradiated nuclear fuel, is so radioactive that literally, unless you have robotic equipment capable of remote handling, you simply can't access those irradiated fuel elements. However, you need a special facility called a reprocessing plant. This is not a simple facility. It's a facility that would have to be built. Now, in New Brunswick, they're talking about building exactly such a facility. Right beside the Moltex reactor, which is a small modular reactor that's cooled with molten salt. Right beside that plant, they're going to build a small reprocessing plant, which would extract plutonium from existing plutonium fuel in order to use it in a liquid form as fuel for that new reactor that they're proposing to build. All of this is being proposed. Now, the difficulty with building such a plant, a plutonium separation plant, is if that becomes part of the strategy that you're exporting, then you're exporting not only the plutonium producing machine, but also the machine that will extract that plutonium and make it available for whatever use you wish to put it to, whether it's civilian or military. So that is seen as a particularly dangerous project from an international perspective. And there has been a good deal of opposition. In fact, 5 letters have been sent to Prime Minister Trudeau from about a dozen non-proliferation experts in the United States, asking Canada to please do a very careful review of the non-proliferation implications of building such a plant in the first place, particularly with a view to exporting it later on. So that's a grave concern. Did I answer the question? I'm not sure if I got lost along the way there. What was the question again? It was, oh yes, about the small modular reactors, in other words, don't automatically remove the firewall. It's only those reactors that have also a reprocessing plant that would remove the firewall. Nevertheless, I think Mr. Belanger raised some very, he gave an excellent presentation, and he pointed out that in these remote communities, it's extremely difficult to monitor all these remote communities. So who knows what's happening there? Who knows who might be having access to that material? Many people are not aware that even here in Canada, our nuclear reactors are inspected by international inspectors to ensure that the plutonium is not being mishandled or diverted for weapons use. It may seem a little bizarre, but anything can happen. You know, we have to remember that before Hitler came to power, there was a peaceful republic. And you might have thought, well, there's no danger of a nuclear bomb there. You can't take such things for granted. So having nuclear reactors spread all over is going to make the job of maintaining the distinction between civilian use and military use very difficult.
This is a question for me. I'm not sure who to ask, but like with all the push from like dirty energy companies trying to say.
Oh, you're frozen.
Just froze. Is there like there seems to be no connection between rising sea levels and nuclear power plants that are on water at lake shores?
Well, if I may say, there has been a problem in France, for example. The rivers have been heating up so much in these hot summers that they have to shut the reactors down. They have to shut down reactors. In fact, I believe in the last calendar year, they have about 54 nuclear reactors in France, and half of them were shut down, half of them. And in fact, Germany, surprisingly enough, was exporting electricity to France rather than vice versa. Whereas Germany has shut down all of its nuclear power plants. France is depending very heavily on its nuclear power plants. But when half of them are shut down, they have to buy power from someone else, and they've been getting it from Germany. Now, the reason why the temperature is important is because when the rivers get too warm, they no longer do a good job of cooling the reactor. And you've got to cool the reactor. If you don't cool the fuel, that's when you run the risk of melting. The fuel can overheat. And when the fuel overheats, it kind of has ruptures in the cladding, the coating of the fuel. And that allows the escape of radioactive materials into the environment. So it becomes a safety issue, a serious safety issue, to ensure that the plant is not run when the cooling is inadequate. And as the rivers get warmer, this becomes a difficulty. And it's going to get worse, presumably, as time goes on.
So when water is contaminated, it's contaminated with radionuclides. Can you explain what that is to our audience?
Yeah, they're simply materials. They're materials. The heavy ones are like heavy metals, only they're radioactive heavy metals. The light ones are chemicals that are quite common in our environment, like iodine, strontium, cesium. These are all things in our environment which are not radioactive. But what the nuclear reactor does is it creates radioactive versions of these otherwise non-radioactive materials. So when the radioactive varieties get out into the water or into the food chain or into the environment, then they enter the body through our food, through our drink, just like everything else. And some of them, depending on the chemistry of these things, they will go to different organs. For example, iodine goes to the thyroid gland. But when it's radioactive iodine, it's going to damage the thyroid because those atoms are exploding and damaging the cells. And that, for example, 5,000 children had to have their thyroids surgically removed in Belarus after the Chernobyl accident because they got radioactive iodine in their thyroid. Other materials will go to other parts of the body. And depending where they go, that's where they do the damage. So when we talk about contaminated water, we're talking about materials in the water, which, unlike most materials, have unstable atoms that are exploding. And it's the explosions of those atoms that happen to be particularly damaging. So on top of let's take, for example, lead. Lead, we know, is a toxic material to begin with. It's a dangerous material. You don't want to get lead into your system if you can help it. But radioactive lead is far worse, because not only does it have the chemical toxicity, but it also does the radioactive damage as well. And since nuclear energy is so much more powerful than chemical energy, the damage is that much greater.
This next question, which Paul has a question here that actually we'll ask this one first. How long? Oops, I just lost it. Paul, do you want to just go ahead and ask that?
Yes, I've heard different comments on when are we going to experience the first SMR, or how long is the process in Canada? So how long do you think it'll take? This is for both of you. Will it take for a SMR to be approved, then built, then operating in Canada?
Well, they have a license application right now for a boiling water reactor, very different from any reactor we've ever had in Canada before. A boiling water reactor designed by General Electric Hitachi. It's called the BWRX 300, and I believe that Saskatchewan has expressed an interest in also ordering one of those reactors if the one in Ontario it turns out to be operating in a satisfactory way. So they have an application for a license to construct, but they have that license has not been granted yet. Those hearings will take place probably in this calendar year. And that would be the first one. It's a 300 megawatt electricity. So it's about 1/3 of the size of the Darlington CANDU reactors that are already on the site. And if they are successful, they would like to build perhaps 4 of them. So they'd be talking about a total of 1,200 megawatts that way. But that would be, it's anybody's guess as to how rapidly that project is going to progress. They would like to have it up and running before 2030, but my hunch is that that's not going to happen. There's no BWRX reactor operating anywhere in the world, and the predecessor of the BWRX was the ESBWR, which also was never built. So it's fine to talk about these things as plans on paper. It's something else when you actually come to try and build them. You find all kinds of things that can slow down the operation and can also escalate the price. And by the way, when the interest rates are so high as they are right now, that adds to the total cost of building a nuclear reactor, because most of the expense of a nuclear reactor is the money you have to borrow. You have to borrow to build it, and if you have to pay interest on that, that's one of the reasons why the government of Canada has intervened and given Ontario a low interest, possibly zero interest, $900 million loan. And that's because in order to keep trying to keep the costs down. These things are going to be very expensive, and some people feel that that they're going to be sufficiently expensive that they're just not going to get off the ground. That was what happened with the first nuclear renaissance. They wanted to build all these large reactors. They thought they would be safer, cheaper, and faster. They were none of those things. So they hope that they'll be able to hit the jackpot with these small modular reactors, but time will tell.
Can I make a quick further point on the timing piece? And so the best case scenario we hear from proponents of SMRs in Canada is 2029, 2030, something like that. That date has a lot of implications for decarbonization of the electrical grids in provinces like Saskatchewan and Alberta, where we still have a lot of fossil fuel generated electricity. And so this is part of a bigger puzzle and a dilemma between the federal government and provincial governments, where certain provinces like our own are really betting hard on SMRs becoming viable. They know that even the best case scenario, they're not going to be viable enough to decarbonize and bring our electrical grid to net zero by the 2035, I think is the deadline that the federal government's given for this. And so there's some fear that chasing this option, this kind of solution for the baseload power piece, could be a strategy that allows for also the entrenchment of fossil fuel powered electricity. I mean, here we see in Saskatchewan coming online new natural gas powered electricity, with the idea that that's just an interim measure before SMR solves all of our problems. So we're really betting big on those optimistic deadlines too, because otherwise there are a whole host of questions about the future of our electrical grid and the viability of net zero as a target.
Thank you so much. I do have one question. I know we're right on our time, but I'm going to ask it anyways. And I know it's kind of a loaded question because we are publicly watching Indigenous communities resist deep nuclear repositories. But the question is, how do these companies claim that they're going to safely store this waste for millions of years?
Well, it's a lot of hubris, actually, because if I may refer back to what I talked about that's happening tomorrow, the protests on Ottawa Parliament Hill. This is the Algonquins. 10 out of the 11 Algonquin nations involved are against this surface dump, which is 7 stories high, and it's an earthen mound that's supposed to last for 100,000 years and more. I mean, give me a break. It's very hard to believe that we can be so foolish as to think that our science allows us to build an earthen mound that's going to last that period of time. The pyramids of Egypt are only 5,000 years old. Now, when you go deep underground, the idea there is that if we go, we take the Canadian Shield, which we know has been stable for billions of years without major disruptions. So this is called an undisturbed geological formation. So the idea is that if we could put it deep underground in an undisturbed geological formation, then that should be safe for another billion years. Unfortunately, you can't get it into an undisturbed geological formation without first disturbing it. And so you create the pathways that weren't there before by simply building the facility. So it's like trying to say that you can have a mine and you can close the mine, but can you restore the mine to the initial integrity of the rock that was there before you had the mine? Nobody has ever done that. So the idea that science can solve this problem of putting the waste in a place that nature can't get at it for the next million years is something that really it goes beyond science. It's a trans-scientific thing. Some people call it trans-scientific. And other people have pointed out that actually it's not so much the safety even when it's underground, but on the way to the bank, how much of it do you lose? Because, for example, in Ontario, they're going to be shipping it. First of all, they have it right now in dry storage containers that are 7 times the mass of the fuel inside. That's simply to protect it from the radiation. Then you have to transfer them into transport containers. And then you have to ship it up to the site, wherever the site is, where you're going to bury it. And then you have to put it into burial containers. Every time you handle the fuel, and this is something people don't often understand, handling the fuel is very dangerous because any kind of crack or pinhole allows radioactive materials to escape and contaminates the environment. So damaged fuel is very dangerous. And how do you prevent it from being damaged during all these transitions? So the question as to how much of that material actually escapes before it ever gets put underground is another question. Anyway, I just would like to make one comment that kind of combines both of the presentations you heard tonight. And that is that what we have with these machines, nuclear reactors, whether they're large or small, is you have several decades worth of benefit, whatever that benefit may be. And then you have thousands and thousands and thousands of years of radioactive waste and headaches to keep that radioactive waste out of the environment, to keep it out of our food, our water, and so on. It seems to me that it's common sense that before you build these plants, you have to look really carefully at what you're going to end up with, which is all that waste and all that decommissioning. And you have to have very clear plans as to how it's going to be handled. It turns out that these small modular reactors often produce irradiated fuel that is far more dangerous than the CANDU irradiated fuel that we currently have from the CANDU reactors. Why is that? Well, because in order to make it small, they make more uranium-235 in every kilogram. So they use what's called enriched fuel, and they enrich it to a degree that has never been done before in commercial reactors. In many cases, they enrich it, they call it HALEU. It's high assay enriched fuel. Well, when you do that, you create the possibility of underground episodes occurring, even a spontaneous chain reaction underground, which would be an unintended chain reaction occurring underneath the in that underground repository. These things are not impossible, although they're unlikely. But in order to put this material, to handle it safely for generations to come, this should be factored into the cost, and it should also be factored into the environmental assessment that is done, which right now we're doing our best to get rid of. The Canadian government has done everything in its power to eliminate environmental assessments for all but the largest of these small modular reactors. So I think that we're heading in the wrong direction. We seem to be more concerned with solving the problem of the nuclear industry maintaining its, well, staying alive, than we are in protecting future generations. And that's not a new story, but it's something that I think that if we want to survive on this planet, we have to start thinking more in terms of what we're leaving behind. The thing about wind and solar and so on is they do not release any toxic materials during their operation. They do not create new toxic materials other than what went into the construction. And they do not leave the same kind of legacy for future generations. They do involve the use of toxic materials, and those toxic materials have to be handled very carefully, but they can be recycled. The waste from a nuclear reactor cannot.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all our guests tonight. We really appreciate you joining us. Tonight was the second installment of a 4-part series on uranium. And we'd like to invite you to join us again on February 27th, when we're going to discuss the health impacts of uranium mining on Indigenous bodies. So check back with us, Keepers of the Water. This webinar and part 1 will be available for sharing on our Facebook and YouTube pages. We really encourage you all to keep the conversation going. Thank you again, and we'll see you all on the 27th. Miigwech.
Miigwech.
And okay, we are now not streaming anymore.
Okay.